Okay, so let's dig into our material for tonight, which is again 2 chapters in Mark, and we also are dealing with something that has, to the average Bible reader, has often troubled them, and we're going to talk about it. And that is when you have a text interrupted by lines that say, these words do not exist in some of the most ancient and trusted manuscripts. And so we will look at that because this shows up in tonight's passage at the end of the Gospel of Mark. And so one wants to deal with that. Why is that in our Bibles as such? So I'm going to read the whole thing. This is the crucifixion. Very powerful passage. Luke probably has more material. John kind of elongates it. As usual, Mark is just the facts, and he gives us the details as he recalls them, probably from the Apostle Peter. So, Mark chapter 15. Let me bring up the passage here. And here we go. Very early in the morning, the chief priests, with the elders and the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said so," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of." But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. "Do you want me to release you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to them. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. What shall we do? What shall I do then with the one you call king of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them, and he had Jesus flogged and handed them over to be crucified. The soldiers led Jesus away to the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put on a purple robe on him, and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. They began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff, spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him, and when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put on his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull, and they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was 9 in the morning when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right, one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. Come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross that we may see and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults upon him. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling for Elijah." Someone ran and filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down," he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. When the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. It was the preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath. So as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph brought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in the linen, and placed it in the tomb cut out of a rock. When he had rolled the stone against the entrance of the tomb, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph saw where he was laid. When Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away, and they entered the tomb. They saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Now comes the interruption. The earliest manuscripts and some ancient witnesses do not have verses 9 to 20. 9. When Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him and who were mourning and weeping. When they heard that Jesus was alive and that she had seen him, they did not believe it. Afterward, Jesus appeared in a different form to 2 of them while they were walking in the country. These returned and reported it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. Later, Jesus appeared to the 11 as they were eating. He rebuked them for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. He said to them, "Go into the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. Whoever does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will drive out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes with their hands. And when they drink deadly poison, it will not hurt them at all. They will place their hands on sick people and will get well." After the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was taken up into heaven, and he sat at the right hand of God. Then the disciples went out and preached everywhere, and the Lord worked with them and confirmed his word by the signs that accompanied it. Okay, that is the whole of the book of Mark. Let's go right to the beginning and dig in. Verse 1 of chapter 15, I just want to bring up where we ended last time. It was right as Peter denies Jesus. So if you see the sentence right before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times, and he broke down and wept. So we ended last week with Peter grieving over that he had denied his Lord. I mentioned last week that it is intriguing, since we believe Mark is capturing Peter's point of view with the gospel. That's what the internal evidence leads us to believe. The fact that Mark contains more information conveying Peter's failure, that he even rained down curses, really shows Peter's humility to reveal this to John Mark as he's recording his gospel. In other words, he didn't hide his junk from John Mark, but actually ends up in Mark's gospel. So verse 1 of chapter 15, very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders and teachers of the law and the whole Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is what? It's a Jewish council. In other words, this is the seat of power for the Jewish community in Jerusalem. And so it's very unusual that they would have this very early meeting of the Sanhedrin. But in this case, because they're wanting to beat the Passover, which is going to, or I should say Sabbath, which is going to happen at sunset of that day, they call an early meeting to try to get this taken care of. And they made their plans. So they bound Jesus and led him away and handed him over to Pilate. Now, why would they even care about Pilate's opinion? What's the big deal?
Wasn't he the Roman in charge of the garrison there?
He was the Roman in charge, that is correct, and the Jews did not have the authority to put somebody to death. Because if they wanted to put him to death, what would they probably have done if it was legal for them? Stone him, yes. And so they realized they don't have that authority. Now there is evidence that Jews from time to time did do it. It was like a crime of passion, where they would all gather stones and stone somebody without approval. But the problem is, you know how sometimes if it's an unknown person, you can get away with stuff. But Jesus is a very known person. He is preaching in the temple each day. They can't bypass the law in this circumstance. They would be incriminated. And so, in this case, they're wanting to dot the I, cross the T. And so, they take him to Pilate. And so, Pilate's words are recorded here. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. To which Jesus replies, "You have said so." Now, that's...
Or is this your question? Has someone told you about me?
Say it again.
Is this your question, or has someone told you about me in John?
What do you mean?
The Gospel of John?
Yes.
Pilate asked him the same question. Are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus says, is this your question, or has someone told you about me?
Oh, okay, yes, yes. You're getting a different perspective of what's happening when you read John's Gospel. Jesus' answer is kind of cryptic, as to what he says. So you say, or so you have said. And if you, I heard, how they have on TV these live musicals that they've been doing from time to time. Mm-hmm. The next one they're going to do is Jesus Christ Superstar, I understand. But one of the things in the old musical is that the Jesus says something like this, like you say it is, and Pilate responds in the song, "What do you mean by that? That is not an answer." And it's actually a very satisfying response of Pilate, because like, "Lord, I don't understand what you're exactly saying." But it goes on here. The chief priests accused him of many things. Now what they're seeking to do is to make this huge case of everything that is possibly wrong with Jesus. Now, what's the one thing they're not bringing up? Blasphemy. Because the Romans don't have a law against blasphemy. You can say that you're God. They'll lock you away in the loony bin, But they realize, Jesus saying, "And you will see the Son of Man returning in the clouds," ain't going to hold any water with Pilate. So they are bringing up every, traffic infringement, anything that they could. And they're probably trying to hang on him that insurrection, meaning that he is the king of the Jews. And that seems to be what Jesus is referring to and what Pilate is referring to. So that would be, in their world, a claim of insurrection. But the fact that they accused him of many things, they're trying to make a case that this person, how could you possibly, not find this person guilty? And you ever see, like in the election, if you were opposed to Hillary or if you were opposed to Trump, what you see is this massive list of every reason why you should not vote for this person. And it's, what's the phrase, that thou dost protest too much? It's like pushing the boundary to where you're starting to wonder, what is your case? And Pilate smells a rat here. He does. Because he's going to say so later on, saying that he senses that they are just doing this for self-interest. So Pilate can tell something's up here. But it says here, so again Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer?" See how many things they are accusing you of. Now that is a tough thing. If you've ever been accused and you just keep your mouth shut, that's really hard. One of the biggest challenges when, did anyone go to the Fight Fair thing for husbands and wives? We had this Fighting Fair seminar. One of the things that you're supposed to not do when you're in a fight with your spouse, actually when you're in a fight with anyone, is get really defensive. Because when you're defensive, it actually works to the opposite. It's conveying that you're not hearing what the person is saying. You're not even wanting to consider that there's an element of truth in what they're saying. Jesus is just silent. And so they're saying these, what amounts to ridiculous things about him, and he's just quiet. This turns out to be a fulfillment of prophecy, and a passage which is just going to come into our minds time and time again as we look at this is Isaiah 53. And it is worth taking a few minutes to look at it. Isaiah writes, "Who has believed our message, and who has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering, familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each one of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid upon him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as the sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and to cause him to suffer." That's a very strong statement. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring, and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. Very, very intense prophecy. 700 years before this is taking place. 700 years. This, by the way, if you look at Jewish articles and books, and you're trying to say that Jesus is not their Messiah, this is where they spend most of their time. Because this is such a devastating prophecy about Jesus in terms of the detail of how he dies and what happens. Because what a Jewish person will say, well, it's a metaphor for Israel. But it's like, it doesn't make sense. Israel is never the one who's the sinless one. And Israel dying, coming back to life, I mean, it just doesn't make sense when you look at it, but when you see it as relating to Jesus, very powerful. Anyway, here's the first fulfillment in our section here. "Aren't you going to answer?" he says. And he responds without saying anything. So again, Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer?" So see how many things they are accusing you of. But Jesus still made no reply. Pilate was amazed. Now, take note, Mark is writing to, does anyone remember where he's probably writing this gospel? What piece of geography? Italy. Modern day Italy. He's probably writing in the Roman area. He's writing to a non-Jewish group of people. How do we know that? It's because he's explaining Jewish customs to them all through his gospel. He tries to explain this is what the Jews do so people can understand. But he's also writing to people that are under Roman authority, and he gives Pilate actually a fairly positive perspective in the sense that Pilate's smelling a rat in terms of what is going on with these Jewish leaders, and he is amazed by Jesus, fascinated by him. That's not necessarily positive or negative, but it causes us to say he sees something in Jesus which perplexes him. And we read now, verse 6, "Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in an uprising." Now, what's intriguing here, he was in prison for a Roman offense, insurrection. Jesus is accused of Jewish religious offenses. And you would think, this is not the smartest moment in Pilate's life. Let's release the one who wants to start revolution and has actually murdered people, and let's acquiesce to this group of religious leaders who want to do in this Jesus, who I don't have any information about him not supporting Rome. In fact, remember the issue of taxes. Should we pay taxes to Caesar? And Jesus says, show me the coin. A denarius was given to him. And whose picture is on it? Caesar. Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Give to God what is God's. He doesn't speak against, the Roman world. He doesn't speak of insurrection. And yet Pilate is acquiescing to this request relating to Barabbas. So he thinks he has a solution. The crowd came up and asked Pilate, do for them what he usually did. So apparently every year, release a prisoner. It's kind of curious that this habit was there, but apparently it's associated with the Passover. And maybe it's related to, how the Passover, the angel of death passed over a house if you had blood on the doorframe. Maybe it was connected with Passover. We don't know. For this kind of symbolic reason that there could be a prisoner who justice will pass over, and that they won't have to, suffer prison or die at a capital offense. We don't know, but they are requesting that this would happen. This would be a fascinating thing if this existed in our day. I say that only because how many people are incarcerated, and everybody would be like, release this person, release that person. Everybody would have their favorite person to release. So it says here, do you want me to release, verse 9, the King of the Jews? Now, this is another fascinating thing. Pilate is using this phrase, King of the Jews. What do you think the Jewish leaders feel about this phrase?
They hate it.
They would absolutely hate it, which once again gives us the impression that Pilate is razzing them. He really is not feeling the greatest love for these religious leaders, these Jewish leaders. And so, do you want me to release your king to you, who right now is tied up, and yes.
Well, also Pilate is proving that he realizes that that's the accusation. It's that he's
Yes.
King of the Jews, not that he has parking tickets.
Oh, that's yeah.
And the second thing is that Barabbas they don't like to be under Roman rule, really.
No,
The
not
Jews
at all.
don't. So Barabbas should be a favored kind of guy. He was kind of helping them try to break loose, and he happened to kill somebody.
Perhaps, but it shows.
I like Barabbas. Let's save him because he's really thinking the way we want to be, free. And he's hoping to get. He wants to release Jesus, actually.
Right.
Pilate wants to get.
But let's just say, for argument's sake, that we captured Osama bin Laden, and so he's now in New York. He's in Rikers, and everyone's shouting because we're all softies in New York. Oh, release the poor guy, let him go home. That kind of thing. Would it be wise for Pilate? Would it be wise for us to release Osama bin Laden? I mean, it seems contrary to wisdom for Pilate, because he is in charge. He doesn't have to acquiesce to this crowd. He could say, Barabbas is off the list. I agree with you entirely that the people may want Barabbas because they want insurrection. They want the Romans kicked out.
Pilate's motivation is to get Jesus off the hook. Let's give him the best piece of fish that can have, and that's Barabbas.
Maybe. That would be an awful lot of appreciation for Jesus to do
It
that.
is, but he really was, his wife said, hey, this is not to be done.
Right, that's the John account of that.
I think he wants to get
Maybe
Jesus
that's-
off the hook.
Could be. Could be. It's one of those things we don't have the inside scoop as to what is exactly going through Pilate's mind, but that could be part of it. So what then shall I do with the king of the Jews? Verse 12. Oh, excuse me, skip verse 11. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. Now, what you have here is mob. And mob can be very, very powerful. One of the things I found fascinating I follow politics and stuff, and in England when they had what was it called? Brexit? Something like that? Brexit? It was this, vote as to whether to leave the European market. And it was more people voted on that vote than any other vote in all of British history.
Wow.
And it was the vote to remove. As soon as the vote took place, the next day there were like 500,000 protesters in the street of London protesting the results of the vote. Which to me smelled bad in this. You just had democracy in its natural outcome. The people voted. So let's try, by mob rule, to reverse a democratic decision. That freaks me out. That scares me. Because that's not the way I want a government to run. If you get more people out marching, that you get to win versus more people voting. In this case, we have a mob action. It is a seated event where you have people of influence. When your rabbi and your leaders, the ones who take your sacrifice each year for your remission of sins, and they're saying, I need you to shout out right now, Barabbas. It's like a very unhealthy peer pressure in terms of what is going on. And so the crowd responds. And they shout out, what shall I do then with the king of the Jews? And Pilate asks them. And the crowd responds, crucify him. Now, the Gospel of John adds one other phrase which is intriguing. It is crucify him, and then comes this phrase, a'azel, which is take him away. Take him away. Why that phrase is interesting is the a'azel is the name of the scapegoat recorded in the law of Moses that the sins of the people are supposed to be placed on and then sent out of the town as a symbolic gesture of the sins of the people being taken away. And in the Gospel of John, they actually use the phrase of the a'azel, meaning take him away, which has this very powerful connotation of the sins of the people are going to be sent out of the gate, which is where Jesus is crucified, and our sins placed on him. But they shout, crucify him. Verse 14, why? What crime has he committed? Now this is after they've listed all their crimes. And Pilate's like, you didn't come up with anything. There is nothing reasonable on your list that I should be responding to. So, how did they respond? Of course, they brought out their best lawyers then and said, well, actually, if you notice the Roman Code, under Title 4, Section 3, Jesus broke this law. Did they do that? No. Let's have the crowd shout louder. Now, Pilate has one primary job as far as Rome is concerned. That primary job is keep the peace. Keep the peace. There was a phrase I heard once when my kids were little. It was this: moms and dads don't want justice. They want quiet. So when two kids are saying, he took my toy, no he didn't, we really don't care in our heart of hearts. We just want peace. That's what we really want. And that is actually what Pilate is supposed to be preserving. And so if a riot ensued and required Roman forces, which because there's only a limited battalion available to them, and they lost control, and now it's going to require a general from some faraway place to come to Israel to quash this little rebellion, Pilate's going to be axed. He's done. And so what their biggest tool against Pilate is this feeling that something is going out of control and cannot be maintained and cannot be held back. So what they're doing, whether it's through their brilliance or just their own passions, by shouting all the louder, "Crucify him," then we read that very telling phrase, "wanting to satisfy the crowd," which I think is just another way of saying wanting to avoid insurrection, wanting to avoid a riot, wanting to avoid the Antonio fortress needing to move the 600 troops that are stationed there to have to come run and defend the palace because of this riot that is ensuing. He acquiesces. Kind of. Pilate releases Barabbas to them, which they may want as a benefit of this whole thing. But he says, "I'll have Jesus flogged." Now, how many of you, just out of curiosity, saw the Passion of the Christ? Raise your hand. Okay, about half of you or so. One of the things that is difficult to watch in the Passion of the Christ, of the many things that is difficult to watch in the Passion of Christ, is the flogging. But one of the things that is very accurate in the Passion of the Christ is the flogging. Because what we have is what is often described as the cat of nine tails, in which you have a whip that has all these strings on it, but it's not just a whipping with leather straps. At the end of each leather straps are pieces of bone, of rock, of jagged metal, and the whole idea is when you are whipped with this, that it is actually grabbing hold to flesh, and when you pull back the whip, it is tearing skin. And when you see this in the Passion of the Christ, which is exactly what happens, and there's a scene in the Passion of Christ which really freaks you out. You see him trying to pull the whip out of his back, and he can't quite get it, so then he yanks it out, and it really conveys the pain. It is common in those days that if you were flogged, that it would kill you. The Jewish law had this thing that if you were flogged 39 times, that would not be a death sentence, but over 39 times would be a death sentence. And so I think Matthew gives some more information on the flogging. I did not look it up for this class. But the bottom line, it's a torture. But it wasn't an official death sentence. He may die through flogging, but he may not. So
why did he have him flogged? He's going to hand him over to be crucified.
Well, he hasn't committed to that.
Well, it says in the next sentence. He handed him over to be crucified. And
Oh, okay, you're right. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. I think if your teacher had done better work for today, he would have read all four Gospels and brought them together. I think what Mark is doing here is bringing the two together. Meaning, I think there is a pause between the two in the other Gospels. Here it is, Mark is just the facts man. He's bringing this in a very brief way. But I think at least one of the other Gospels gives a pause there because there's a visit to Herod, which Mark doesn't mention at all. And I think that is what is occurring when we see that. I don't know for sure offhand because I confess I did not read the other three Gospels in preparation for this class. So, we move now to the soldiers.
Scroll, please.
Oh, thank you. Okay. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace. That is the praetorium. Now, I want to give you, there's some debate as to where this is. So, let's see here. Okay, here is the scale model of Jerusalem, of the Temple Mount. So this is the Antonia Fortress. We believe that there is, it says here, a whole company of soldiers. A company is 600 soldiers. We know that through extra biblical material. And they are stationed here. There is still the foundation of this building still there. Everything is torn out. You know, this building is not here today, but the foundation does exist. Thank you. The foundation does exist, and this is one of the proposed sites that this is taking place right now. However, there are those who argue Pilate would not be staying in a barracks. He would be staying in a more palace-oriented place. And so some argue that this may be taking place somewhere over here instead of over here. It's hard to know. We don't have hard details as to what is taking place, but...
Well, maybe it was the judgment seat where he judged Christ, where that took place. Right? Remember?
Well, when you say judgment seat, what are you referring to?
When Pilate was judging Jesus, he pulled him out of, I guess, the prison or whatever he was in, getting beaten, and he pulled him out to this place, the judgment seat, and I forget what else it's called. And that's where he judged him, and that's where they said, you know, crucify him. And that's when they went someplace else in the book of John.
Right, but we're still not exactly sure where that is in terms of the judgment seat. Is it actual? It's the Hebrew phrase is the bema, or seat of mercy or seat of justice. Right. That would not be applicable for Romans because they could care less about Jewish justice per se. It's probably some kind of official court environment. One thing for sure, here's the scale model of what Jesus' last days. So here's the Garden of Gethsemane. Here's where he's arrested. Then he is brought to the high priest. Then we see the palace of Herod. This is combining the Gospels. Then to the palace of Herod. This is, where he says Praetorium here, question mark. This is where they're speculating that this is not Antonia Fortress over here, but this map is speculating that he's in the palace, which is probably Herod's palace that Pilate is using. And then here is another palace where Herod is, and then back over here where he meets with Pilate, and that's when he says, crucify him. And then we have here going out to traditional location of Golgotha. Yeah. So, again, I'm just some debate as to where this is taking place. You
the Temple of Solomon's Temple on that little square there? That's Solomon's Temple?
This right here is the Temple Mount. Solomon's Temple was destroyed.
Already.
This is the temple that Herod built.
Oh, okay.
And this is the grand one.
It's basically in the same place, basically.
What do you mean? Same location.
Right.
Yes, same location. Exactly. So, let me go back to our text here. And they called together the whole company of soldiers. Now comes mocking. They put a purple robe on him. Why? He's the king of the Jews. So let's pretend he's the king. And so this is purely to mock him. And they twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. I'm regretting that I didn't bring a crown of thorns with me. I have one in the office at church. An actual full-size crown of thorns. Because when you handle this thing, it freaks you out. You know, that this would be placed on somebody's head. So it is the device to mock. It is a device to cause pain. And it is part of what the soldiers are doing to just increase torture. One of the things that the Romans had mastered is torture and death. They're very, very good at it. In fact, we'll talk about that when we talk about crucifixion in a moment. But they were really good at bringing about the most painful death possible. That was their goal, and they used it to kind of send a signal.
When they say purple robe, they also mean scarlet? Could they-
Well, yeah, you could probably use that. It's probably a translation issue as to what you want to say. And they began to call out, "Hail, King of the Jews." Again, they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. What we know what the Romans would do is they would cover your face and then strike you. The thing is, if you're wearing a bag over your face, you can't deflect hits, and you get all the force of the hit affects you. It's just the reality of when you're in a kind of a fight, when you can see where the punch is coming, you're able to move your head a little bit, and it enables you to cushion the blow. But when you are covered, it just means pain as to what. And we know this because in another gospel it actually means, "Who hit you?" You know, they're actually asking. So we know that his face is covered. And again they struck him on the head with the staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees,
They're striking him on the head with the crown of thorns on his head, right?
well, yes, whether they're hitting the crown of thorns, I can't say, because that could destroy the crown of thorns too. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on, and they led him out to crucify him. So here is, to go back to our picture again, the question is, where is this Golgotha right here? One thing we know, if you notice, here is the city wall at the time of Christ, right there. This is outside the city wall. We absolutely know it's outside the city wall. Now, we had a couple who just came back from Israel. There are two proposed sites where this took place. One is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which no Protestant wants to be the official site of where Jesus died and rose again. And the reason is because it looks like a big old gaudy church, and it just doesn't look like you want it to in your mind. But when you go to the Garden Tomb and you see the place, well, it looks like a place of a skull, and you see this ancient tomb, and it's a garden, you love it. This is where I want, Jesus to have died and been raised to life. The problem is the evidence of history is overwhelmingly for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And it's an interesting story as to why it is the evidence of history. It is because Hadrian, who lived around 150 AD, he was a Roman emperor. He hated this new sect called Christians. And he wanted to destroy this sect in every way he could. So he investigated and found out, where do these Christians celebrate the place of Jesus' death and resurrection? And they said, "Oh, that's easy. It's right over here." And he says, "Great. This is where I will desecrate it." And so he puts up all these pagan gods and plants this grove to celebrate all pagan worship, just so Christians would be offended. Just picture, a sacred place that Christians have. Let's open a whole series of adult bookstores and all this kind of stuff that Christians don't want to be anywhere near. And so, time moves on, 150 years, and Constantine gets saved. He becomes a Christian. First emperor who's a believer. Well, his mommy, who is a Christian, she says, "Well, my son's the emperor, and I am going to build the church everywhere where Jesus did something." And so she goes to Israel, and she builds a church over Bethlehem, Church of the Nativity. And she says, "Where was our Lord crucified?" And the Christians said, "Oh, that's easy. It's where Hadrian set up his pagan gods." She goes, "Wonderful." Plows them all down and puts up the first church of the Holy Sepulchre. The church that's there today is mostly built in the Middle Ages, although there are parts of it that do date from, I think her name is Catherine, who did it. But in any case, that is why the evidence for Church of the Holy Sepulchre is probably the best location for this. Now, here's a little interesting tidbit. We have no biblical evidence that where Jesus was crucified was a hill. Now, we sing lots of songs. "I believe in a hill called Mount Calvary." We sing songs about it, but there's actually no biblical passage that says it has to be a hill. Could be a hill. And actually, in Jerusalem, it's filled with hills. So it's possible that it's a hill. We don't know. But we do know it's a place of the skull. And we do know it is someplace public on a road so that this sign would be appropriate over the head. Now, there's some debate of what the cross looked like. Some have said it looks like this. Some have said it looks like, kind of an X as to how people have done. The good evidence is that it does look similar to our cross that we have hanging in churches or on steeples, and that is because of this sign, meaning King of the Jews. The fact that that sign is there conveys that it's probably in this kind of shape, that it's showing. And let me go back here. Anyway, that's where they're leading him, and that's where he's going to be crucified. And the reason they want a sign there, they did this all the time, Romans, and they wanted it on a public place so others see. And when it says King of the Jews, it's kind of a message. If you want to declare yourself King of the Jews, this could happen to you. There was a speaker at the Leadership Summit who was making reference of how do you influence people. And one of the comments was, you ever notice that sometimes people drive in the HOV lane that probably shouldn't be in the HOV lane? Almost never. New Yorkers never break the law that way, but occasionally it happens. So anyway, the state of Washington wanted to see if they could lower this. And so the person who was giving this address, Joseph Grenny, he said, the only way you can really do well is public hangings. He says it really, stops people from breaking the law. But short of public hangings, which is, not very common in our day, what are the ways you could do it? So what they did, not wanting to hire any more police officers, because that costs lots of money, they put these signs up. If you see somebody riding in the HOV lane, text this number. And in theory, it's supposed to be the passenger in the car texting the number. And if your license plate gets texted, you get an official letter from the state saying you were spotted in the HOV lane. And now, the first letter looks like a friendly letter. If you get texted again, it looks like a business letter. If you get texted a third time, it looks like you're going to court. Now, you're really not, but the letter is designed that way to make you feel absolutely rotten. They brought down the people violating the HOV lane from like 90% to 30% because people didn't want to be shamed in that way. It actually affected them. The Romans are not under that problem, though. So they do with the public hanging. They let everyone know. And just imagine growing up in a world like this, where your children are seeing people die on a regular basis at the hands of the Romans. It must freak you out. I mean, it probably gets you to be calloused, about death even. But that is why it is a public place. And one of the things I love about the Garden Tomb, what's right next to the Garden Tomb? Did you notice? It's a bus station. And I like, in some respects, when you go to the Garden Tomb, you're like, oh, it's not unfortunate there's a bus station there. And it's like, no, actually, that's the way it was. Because if this is where Jesus was crucified, it was in a very public spot where he was crucified. So, Jesus is carrying a cross now. We estimate the cross to weigh 40 pounds, just based on what we know of Roman crucifixions. He has been flogged. People often die from flogging. So the fact that he is now carrying a cross of 40 pounds, he's very frail. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country. They forced him to carry the cross. Now this is intriguing because why in creation does Mark mention the father of Alexander and Rufus? Now, that is a common way in the ancient world to identify people. You mention who they're related to. But why would Mark expect anyone to know these two? we believe the reason why Mark puts these names here is they are known Christians. Now, by the time Mark is writing it, and one of the little pieces of evidence of this is the end of Paul's letter in Romans, in which Paul says, "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who has been a mother to me too." Now, where is Mark writing? In modern-day Italy. Where is Paul writing? To the Roman church. Greet Rufus. So there seems to be some evidence that when the reason why Mark is mentioning who this guy Cyrene is in the context of mentioning Rufus and Alexander is that these are known people and possibly known Christians.
Can you imagine if you were Simon in the crowd and the Romans go, "You, help this man carry his cross"? I'm like,
Freak you out.
yeah, I'm like, get away.
It would freak you out. I mean, this Jesus going to crucifixion. I don't want to be mistaken and have them crucify me, because I'm carrying the cross.
Right.
And the soldiers are like, "Oh, here's the next guy."
Exactly. I'd be scared.
It's a very, very frightening and scary thing. Anyway, he's on the way from the country. Now, where is Cyrene? It's North Africa. So, modern-day Libya, possibly. We know he's from that area, and he's probably Jewish. And why do you think he's in Jerusalem?
Passover.
Passover, exactly. Because every good Jew wants to get to Jerusalem for Passover, if at all possible. But he has a rude awakening when he's coming into town, when he is brought into service. And the Romans had that authority. Remember when Jesus said, if somebody asked you to carry their cloak for 1 mile, carry it 2? Romans would do that all the time. Soldiers had that authority. And their legal authority was for 1 mile. So Jesus said, carry it 2. Go above the legal requirement. So they know, this is just Roman law. If a soldier asks you to do something, you do it. Let me put it this way. The guy on United Airlines who was dragged off the plane, that wouldn't really happen in the Roman world. And then he gets a lawsuit, and then he, wins all this money for disobeying the law, which boggles my brain. But in any case, this is something that is just their world. You just have to do what these soldiers say. And they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Inference is that this is where lots of crucifixions took place. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh. Now, this has a numbing effect. And you may think that it is of kindness, to numb him out. But now here's where we need to talk about crucifixion. Crucifixion was masterfully thought out to impact none of your major organs, to keep them all intact, and to have very little blood loss by where they put the nails. The point is that you will live as long as possible so that you can have the most excruciating pain for the longest period of time. That is the point of crucifixion. So, this idea of numbing is not mercy. It is actually to preserve more pain for a longer time. However, you would be deceived and take it. Like, oh, I need something, to survive. I want to show you an archaeological find, which is just creepy. But this is a bone with a nail in it that was found from a crucifixion. So this is an actual remains of a crucifixion, a nail going right through a bone to put this person on the post, on the cross. So that just gives you the gruesomeness as it is passed down through us archaeologically in history. And It says they offer, but he did not take the wine mixed with myrrh. He was prepared to take the cup that he asked his father if it would be possible to take away, but he took it. That's what we're preaching on this Sunday, by the way, will be the Garden of Gethsemane. Not my will, but yours be done. And they divided up his clothes and cast lots to see what each would get. I believe, not positive, but I believe it's Matthew that records that it was a seamless garment, and they didn't want to rend it, so they cast lots. So one person would just win the whole thing, while other times they would just, divide it up at the seam and give each person a little piece of the cloth. And it just shows you in the ancient world, things like cloth are very valuable. You don't want to not have it. And so this is the way you gain stuff, is if you have prisoners' stuff that they bring, you bring it home to your wife and they move. Now it says here, they cast lots to see who would get what. This brings us to the next pivotal passage of prophecy, and that is Psalm 22. Psalm 22, look how it begins. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? I'm going to move up and see here. Okay, verse 18. The dogs surround me, a pack of villains encircle me, they pierce my hands and my feet, all my bones are on display, people stare and gloat over me, they divide my clothes among them, cast lots for my garment. Very, very strong prophecy relating to Christ. And when we look at the beginning of this psalm, we see it's a psalm of David. Nothing in David's life reflects this. And so what David is speaking in his poetic style about feeling that he's suffering and what he's going through, the words he uses poetically to describe what he feels he's going through in his life turn out to be prophetic for what a son of David will actually experience. They cast lots for my clothes. Which brings us back to...
How many hundreds of years before was that written?
Well, David lived about 800 BC.
800.
So we're talking about 800 years before the time of Christ. And we read, it was the 9 in the morning when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, the King of the Jews. We also know from other Gospels it was placed in multiple languages. Mark does not include that, but it was placed in multiple languages. They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right, one on his left. Now, both in Psalm 22 and in Isaiah 53, it mentions that his demise was with the villains or the transgressors. Both those prophetic passages speak of Jesus or the prophecy of the Messiah dying with trespassers. In this case, 2 rebels, one on his right, one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads. And that's an exact phrase, again, from Isaiah 53. Wagging their heads. Excuse me, that's from Psalm 22. Let me go back to Psalm 22. Verse 7. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. So again, as we read Mark recalling this, it's exactly the way it's shaking their heads and saying, so, who are you, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself. They're taking a quote from Jesus in which he's referring to his temple, his body, which was going to be destroyed and resurrected in 3 days. they take this quote out of its context and they say, wow, if you're that great to take Herod's temple and destroy it in one day and rebuild it in 3, go ahead. Take him down from the cross. You must be really, really talented. Come down from the cross and save yourself. In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. Interesting phrase now. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. But one commentary I read used the opportunity to list every person that Jesus saved up to this point. And it was a very powerful list. You know, this person, this person, this person, this one. These are the ones we have names of and, encounters. This is not including where it says, and he healed all their diseases. It's just the ones we know, and this is massive list. And you see, they knew this. He did all these good things. He saved others, but himself he cannot save.
But he did it on the Sabbath. That was part of the problem.
Say it again.
He did it on the Sabbath.
Yes, that was a wrinkle for them. Yes. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down from the cross that we may see and believe. I don't think this was a genuine comment of belief here. It's a mock. Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. Now, the following week, what we're going to preach on Sunday morning, is Luke records one interesting story. Because although both thieves heaped insults, we do know that one thief said, "Why do you mock him? We're the sinners. He is not." And Jesus makes that wonderful statement, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Mark does not record that. Mark is recording as he gets it from Peter. Peter is not at the foot of the cross. John is. So we're just getting different perspectives. By the way, if you read all 4 Gospels, you will see differences in the accounts. For example, Mark does not mention Herod. That seems to be a notable thing. And when you just, these little pieces, Mark does not mention "it is finished." Only John mentions that phrase, "it is finished." And sometimes people are like, why are these differences? And it makes them actually doubt or, wonder the historicity of these things. It's actually evidence for the historicity of these things. And the reason is because if you are ever in an accident and there are lots of witnesses, one of the ways the judge immediately knows that this is collaboration and fake is if everyone agrees with each other. What a judge actually wants to hear is a varied perception of what took place. That actually shows there's no collaborating and that this happened. Because one thing, all of them agree. Jesus was crucified in a bloody death, and he died, and he rose again. Everyone agrees, but they're all looking at it from a different angle. And I don't know if you saw the movie Case for Christ with Lee Strobel. If you don't, definitely when it comes on a video, watch it. But what moved Lee Strobel from atheist to believer was that kind of thing. Is because when you see the difference of perception of how Mark looks at it, how Luke looks at it, how Matthew looks at it, how John looks at it, it actually shows they're all looking at the same thing from a different angle and recording what they felt was important to them.
How did he come up with 500 witnesses in
That is the Paul who writes that. And that is in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Now, Paul, very interestingly enough, is the first writer of the New Testament. The Gospels are not the first books written. The first thing that they did was the Gospel spread so quickly, and Paul starts writing these letters to help these Christians learn how to be Christians. But then they realized we need to record what happened for future generations with Jesus, because it was all oral tradition, and so they took the time to write it down. But Paul actually got to see some first-hand accounts. The first, he probably wrote as little as 10 years after the crucifixion happened, when he's writing his first letters as to what's taking place. And he knew of the the massive viewings of Jesus resurrected. So, let this Messiah, King of Israel, come down from the cross, that when you see and believe, those crucified also heaped insults. Now we read his death. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is just Aramaic. Which is, in other words, what you're reading here is what Jesus actually said, how he said it. And which is one of the reasons why when Mel Gibson made The Passion of the Christ, he wanted to use all the original languages. So when they were speaking in Rome, they used Latin. When they were speaking in the to each other, they used Aramaic. When it was potentially Greek, they used Greek. He really wanted to be as much as he could accurate to what actually took place, and then have the subtitles. And then here's the definition Mark is giving him, because nobody in Rome knows Aramaic. My God, why have you forsaken me? By the way, when they say the Bible is written in 3 languages, Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. But there's only little pieces of Aramaic, but this is an example of one of those pieces. When some of those standing near heard this, they said, listen, he's calling Elijah. Now, because the Old Testament implies that Elijah is coming back, Elijah becomes like many of the saints are for Catholics. In other words, oh, St. Joseph, help me, something like that. Catholics will do that sometimes, appeal to a saint. The Jewish community at the time appealed to Elijah that way. And so they thought, oh, he's calling for Elijah, kind of like a Catholic might call for a saint to help him. And so let's see if he comes.
Because of the Eloi he's saying there? Eloi?
Yes, it sounds like Elijah. In other words, they're picking a piece of it. And we don't know who's actually making this comment, but they obviously did not listen in Aramaic and interpret it as potentially Elijah, who again was known. Elijah will come to help the righteous, kind of like, again, a Catholic saint will help the saint of lost causes, or all those descriptions that
Steve,
Catholic community has.
did Elijah appear to Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration
Yes.
with Moses? It was
Yes.
Moses and Elijah, right?
Correct.
Wow.
So someone ran, verse 36, filled a sponge with wine vinegar. Now what is this? This is the kind of wine that a soldier would have. It is cheap wine. That would be. And wine is very popular in that day because it's preservative. In other words, you don't have to keep it refrigerated. And so it's a very common drink. And this was not a nice wine. It was just a common wine that would be available. And put it on a staff and offered to Jesus to drink. And then they said, now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down. Now comes a cry. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. Many believe what he cried was actually audible words that are recorded in the Gospel of John. It is finished. It is finished. Which is John 19, verse 30. It's a very powerful phrase because it speaks of the culmination of completing the task. And here we are, when he had received the drink. So he did take the wine. He said, it is finished, which Mark says with a loud cry. With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. So that is John's version.
Was there a significance to Jesus accepting the wine on the hyssop stick or whatever? Was there a significance to it?
I think people sometimes speculate. I've heard people talk about it. I can't give you one right now in terms of whether it has some spiritual significance. Sometimes you read, like on Facebook, why did Jesus fold the garment in the tomb? And they give you all this, he folded it for this reason and this reason, this reason. Those are interesting. We don't really know with confidence, that that's why he folded it. But they'll speak of, it's kind of like when you're eating dinner, if you're done with your dinner, you leave it at the table, your napkin in a like a knot, just leave it there. But if you're returning to the table, you fold your napkin, and it's a symbol that Jesus is coming back because he folded his garment. My only point is sometimes when you look at things, we can read more into them perhaps than are there, and sometimes there may be some interesting stuff. Do you know of something relating to that? Okay, I can't speak for one.
Would you have said it is finished in Aramaic also?
Yeah, it would be. It would be. But we don't have that. Mark's not recording it. He says a loud cry. And again, he's getting it as Peter is recorded, giving it to him. And the fact that the wine and the cry are associated in Mark, and that the wine and the it is finished are associated in John, which is why many scholars believe that cry is it is finished. Now the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now this is shared in numerous Gospels, and the book of Hebrews elaborates on this. Now, what is this curtain? In the temple, so you have these two places. So this is the temple, and there is a curtain here, and here is the Holy of Holies. And then there is a curtain here, and this is the most holy place. Excuse me, the holy place. This is the most holy place. This is the holy place. And every single day, a priest would come in and burn incense in the holy place every single day. So they would go in through this curtain here, and then they would stop here. Once a year, the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies, which is this right here. This is the curtain that we believe was rent. Now, when you think curtain, what do you think of? The kind that's hanging above your windows. This is not like that at all. This is estimated to be 5 or 6 inches thick. We're talking a wall made of cloth. It is because of the nature of where this is and what it symbolizes. It is movable, but it is heavy. And the fact that it is torn and from top to bottom is very interesting here, because if you could picture, the height of this building is probably at least as high as the peak of our sanctuary at the very top. So let's say that's 40 feet up, 45 feet up, and the curtain extends to the bottom, and it is rent from top to bottom. And the author of Hebrews makes a big deal of this because he speaks of the fact that now we have access to the most holy place through Jesus Christ. So they're probably not sure of the significance of this when it happened. But it is basically at that moment declaring there's no more need for sacrifices. Yes?
Why didn't the priests keep that a secret?
Why did they what?
Why didn't they keep it a secret?
Why didn't they keep it a secret? I don't know. But this happens to be broadly understood through numerous sources that this happened. And it was probably one of those things you just can't control in terms of what happened. I mean, it would be shocking in their world that it happened.
Well, that's the stitch. The high priest would have a rope tied around them and he went behind there.
He would.
In case God struck him down, he could pull his body out.
That's exactly right. They actually had little bells on them, that if the bells stopped ringing, we got to drag this guy out, God struck him dead. And this is because of what's biblical history. You remember when David was trying to move the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, and he chose to use the Philistine method of putting it on a new cart, which was not the biblical method. He chose the Philistine method, and it hit a rock, and then it looked like the Ark was going to fall, and Uzzah reached out and was struck dead by God. They had a deep respect for not messing with the Ark of the Covenant. By the way, there was no Ark of the Covenant in this temple. We know that through all kinds of sources. The Ark was lost somewhere during the Babylonian conquests. And there's all kinds of speculation where the Ark might be. For further information on that, watch the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, and maybe that will lend some insight. So,
Is it believed that God himself rented that curtain?
yes, exactly. That is implied in the text. That is implied in the text. Now, when the centurion, who is it's an interesting thing. If you do a word
John
study,
Wayne.
yes, surely. Centurions are always portrayed in the Bible positively. It's very interesting. It's like there's no bad centurions. They are the ones, pray for my servant, I know he'll be well. Paul deals with positive centurions. This is another. Excuse me?
Cornelius in Acts.
Yeah. They're just all good guys, centurions. It's not a high-level position, but it is a position. It's like when you're moving up. It's kind of like a sergeant kind of thing. But they are always portrayed positively. And he says, surely this man was the Son of God. Now, what did he see that caused this? This is recorded, again, several Gospels, and it's a big deal that Jesus, in his death, is perceived by a pagan viewing it, that this is not something I've ever seen before. And did he come to Christ at this moment? Possibly. That is not necessarily a statement of Jesus is Lord, but it comes pretty close to an acknowledgement that something happened here that I just can't put my finger on. And he's going to come up again in a moment. Some of the women were watching from a distance. Let me move up here.
So you think it was him maybe seeing the darkness over the land for 3 hours and the rending
Well,
of the
we're going to
curtain?
talk about that in just a moment.
Okay.
Some of the women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene. Her claim to fame, Jesus delivered her from demonic possession. And that is, a good reason to follow Jesus. Mary, the mother of James, the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. Now, he goes on to say, in Galilee these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women had come up with him to Jerusalem, were also there. So Jesus had a large following of women. Women play a very crucial role in our evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And it's intriguing because it's a backward way, we would say. If you were fabricating the story about the resurrection, you would never say in Jewish and Roman culture, my primary evidence is women, because women's testimony was not accepted under legal law in both Jewish culture and Roman culture. The very fact that women are the ones who first observed the resurrected Lord actually show the historicity, because you wouldn't use women otherwise to tell the story. You would want to say that the men saw it, but that's not the way it happened. So it actually shows it's probable that this is the way it happened. They wouldn't have mentioned it otherwise. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many of the women had come up to Jerusalem were also there. So you got a cadre of women. It was preparation day. That is the day before the Sabbath, which means before sunset. So we're not talking Thursday. We're talking, it's not sunset yet because Sabbath begins at sunset. So we're talking the hour, whatever the time of sunset is. Let's say it was 6:53 at night. It hadn't happened yet. So if he dies at 3 in the afternoon, then there's some time to do it. So as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, now the council is the Sanhedrin, so this is interesting, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God. So he is not a person who was like opposed to Jesus. He actually is a sympathizer. Where he stands belief-wise, historically, we have some evidence that he converted. But at this point, it's not giving us much information in that he has deep sympathies relating to Jesus. And he went boldly to Pilate. Now, why is this boldly? Because what you deal with, these are thieves. They're thrown into a common pit once they're dead from their crucifixion. There are no graves for these people. It's just a mass grave. And that is the normal procedure. So when he's saying, I'd like to put this person in a grave that only the rich would have an advantage of. And when you've seen the pictures of Jesus' grave with the big round stone in front of it, these were used only by the highest of people. It's very expensive to hewn something like this out of the rock. And by the way, back then they believed in recycling, because you use those big stone graves over and over again. And you're like, what do you mean by that? What you do is you put Aunt Matilda in the grave, you put the stone above it, around it. Then Aunt Matilda turns to bones. And then you open the grave, and you gather Aunt Matilda's bones, and you put them in a box called an ossuary, which is a stone box. I'm trying to think how big it is. It's about the half size of that table, any of these tables here. So talking a stone box about this big. The length of it is, what is the femur from here to here? That is
How
the...
big is your skull, right?
Well, no, it's actually higher than that.
Oh.
It's about this high and this big. And I think I talked about this last week. We actually found Caiaphas's ossuary, as in the high priest Caiaphas. It was unearthed about 20 years ago while they were working on a road around Jerusalem. And we're 90% sure it's actually the Caiaphas ossuary. But anyway, you would then gather Aunt Matilda's bones, put them in the ossuary, and then put the ossuaries where you have other family members. And you put somewhere else. So now you got the tomb to use again. So now Uncle Harry dies. You put Uncle Harry in the big tomb. That's why one of the Gospels mentioned that it was an unused tomb, meaning it never had been used by anyone before. Because when you see that phrase, it should cause you to scratch your head. What's a used tomb? You know, it's kind of bizarre. We don't really reuse our tombs, you know, in that sense. But that is what's taking place here. So he's bold in that these guys are usually thrown into a pit. But he's like, no, I don't want that. And asked for Jesus' body. Now, here's an interesting statement. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was dead already. And he summoned the centurion. So here's the centurion again. Why is he surprised? Because most of these guys survive for 3 days. The whole point is to have them suffer. But if you remember, another gospel says they wanted to break the bones to hasten the death so that they could take these guys off the cross and bury them before Sabbath as a courtesy to the Jews. But when they came to Jesus, he was already dead. But just to make sure he was dead, they pierced the myocardia of his heart. Blood and water from the water sac around the heart comes out, confirming that he is dead. And that's, Pilate's confused. Is he dead? So he asks the death expert. That's a centurion. This is what this guy does for a living. He hangs people on crosses. So he knows if Jesus is dead. This is why the swoon theory, that Jesus, recovered in the cool grave, and he comes out, having been flogged, having been crucified. I'm great, and I'm doing well, and everyone believes he was raised from the dead. It doesn't work that way. He was dead. As the beginning of A Christmas Carol, George Marley was dead. He was dead as a doornail, whatever a doornail is. I think it's the beginning of A Christmas Carol. Jesus was dead. And so Pilate surprised himself. And he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph brought some linen, took the body, wrapped it in linen, placed it in a tomb cut out of the rock, then rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. Now, one of the pictures I wanted to bring for tonight, but I forgot, was, a picture of this tomb. You probably have seen the pictures of this, from time to time. I think I'm online. Let's see if I can grab a quick picture here. Yeah, it's probably going to take too long. Oh, let's see. Maybe not. It's just interesting to see in light of... Now, this is an actual tomb at the time of the New Testament. This is not the tomb. Ah, it's a crummy one. I'm trying to find a bigger picture of this. Okay, there we are. So, this is an actual tomb in Israel. And what's nice about this particular tomb is the stone is still here. Many times when you find these, you'll just see the hole, and you see the rut where the stone will roll. But like when you went to the garden tomb, you'll see this part, but they don't have a stone. That's missing. But this is what it looked like. And so, is that the kind of stone that a couple ladies are going to roll uphill? No. Not a kind of stone a couple guys are going to roll uphill. It is a massive stone, and you could see it is, just highly improbable anything is going to be doing without somebody helping with great strength.
Especially if it was sealed.
Yes. Now, again, Mark doesn't include that piece, but this was, a guard was placed by this tomb. It was sealed with a Roman seal, just so, the Jewish authorities wanting to make sure nobody was going to claim that this body was, that Jesus was raised. And so now we move to chapter 16. And this is the chapter which we have our interesting textual thing. So, when Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. They wanted to give it a proper burial. And so they went very early on the first day of the week. That's early Sunday morning. And here's where you get your origins of sunrise services. Just after sunrise. So when a church wants to do a sunrise service on Jones Beach or something, this is where that comes from. They were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, who will roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb? Great question. They're coming with great intentions, but there is little probability that they're going to be rolling the stone. But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Now, from Luke 24, we know that this is an angel that they saw. But when they entered and did not find the body of Jesus, while they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down and their faces to the ground. But the men said, why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen. Remember, has told you while he was with you in Galilee. So, this personage that Mark is mentioning, again, from his perspective, receiving from Peter, is that there was this young man wearing a white robe sitting beside, and they were alarmed. Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples, and this is a little tidbit that Peter adds with John Mark, and Peter. Tell Peter. Peter wants to make reference to the fact that he mentioned me specifically. Make sure you tell Peter. He's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Trembling, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Now, when it comes to the end of a gospel, that would be a lackluster end to the gospel. They left and they were afraid. And so here comes now the issue relating to these last verses in Mark. And I'm probably going to be answering questions that you're not even asking. But I think it's helpful because when you read a phrase like this, The earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have these verses. Now look what my computer software has done. It's put it in italics. So they're not only putting this little message there, they're also putting it in italics so it stands out. Now, why is it that this is the way it is? So let me show you a copy of a Greek New Testament. Let's see here. Okay, here we are. Let me put this on a bigger screen here. All right, I know you're not going to be able to read this well, but this is Gospel of Mark, and this is what's called the Nestle-Aland Greek manuscript. This is the kind of thing that I would learn Greek from when I learned Greek. So what this is, there's no one copy of the Greek New Testament that dates from, any one day written a long time ago. What they do is scholars put together a text, a Greek text, based on all the documents that they have. In other words, there are over 5,000 historical documents that were found of the Greek New Testament. 5,000! Now, some of them are not very good. Some of them are only a few sentences. Some of them contain the entire book. For example, when you're studying 1 Corinthians, the best manuscript, they all give them code letters, by the way, like P46 is the best manuscript for 1 Corinthians. And so when you're looking at, 1 Corinthians and you're studying the Greek, you might look at P46, and you want to look at the original P46. So what scholars do is they look at all of them, and what they write is where they mostly agree. In other words, this is where they seem to have the most correspondence. And then anytime there is a variance, they put a note here. And so here's a 1. You see a 1 up there. And actually that's referring to a verse number. But you see that's where the 1 is. And what they do is they'll tell you if there is a variant in this sentence, they tell you in here what manuscripts are varying. And so here's where they're saying, these are the code letters for manuscripts. O, B, EV, R, EP, Chi. All of these are just nicknames for manuscripts. And so what they're trying to do is letting the reader know how confident they are that this is the way that it was written. So they're giving the Greek scholar who's using their work, what is their evidence for doing this? So here's the wrinkle for this passage. The oldest and most complete Greek text we have for the Gospel of Mark is called Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. Now, these are Latin terms, and the reason why here is St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Peninsula. In about 150 years ago, they found in this monastery, which dates to 300 AD, Sinaiticus. It's just an ancient manuscript. It contains the Gospel of Mark, and it's a really cool thing. And the beautiful thing is, only found 150 years ago, and it predates other manuscripts we have. So they look at it, and it's missing those verses. And they go, that's interesting. And so the other text, Vaticanus, is held in the Vatican Library, and also dates a similar time frame, and it's missing those verses. But there are texts, Greek texts, that are called A, C, and D. They're all with nicknames, A, C, and D, that have those verses. But they date 100 years later. In other words, so they're saying, what are the oldest manuscripts saying? In Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, they are saying that those verses are not there. It's just not there. It ends with, and the women went away afraid. But later manuscripts, not tremendously later, but a little bit later, say that they were there. But here's where it gets messy. They look now at church fathers. Like, for example, let's say you didn't have the Bible, but you have every sermon Steve ever preached. You know where you would get? A lot of passages of scriptures. So what they do is they study the church fathers. Irenaeus, Tertullian, Origen, St. Augustine. And they look at everything that these guys wrote and what they quote. The earliest church fathers, when they're quoting Mark, they don't mention those verses. But the later church fathers, when they're quoting Mark, they do mention those verses. So they're looking at the evidence and they're saying that it seems, we're late, oh my goodness. We'll wrap up soon. What you're seeing is they're making a decision based on this. But now here's where it gets even fuzzier still. Justin Martyr, who was a church father who lived 160 AD, which is early, he quotes what seems to be a fragment from this section. So, here's what scholars think. There's basically three views. One view is that this section that we are about to look at, that this section was a separate fragment that somebody thought at some point, let's attach it to Mark. Mark is missing an end. And so they put it there. Others think, no, it was created by some church father, not to be mean or evil, but it contains stuff that they thought would fill up Mark's passage to answer some questions, you know, as it was done. And still others believe that we just don't have any ending of Mark and that this just happened to be floating around and it was added. So here's the thing. Does that section, that last section of Mark, add anything to the story that the other Gospels don't really have? Not really. Everything in those last verses is in something else. So let's look at it. When Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, let me go back to my text here. He appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom had driven 7 demons. That almost seems like commentary, you know, in terms of what it was like. She went and told those who had been with him and were mourning and weeping. When they heard that Jesus was alive, she went and said to him, she had seen him, but they did not believe it. Afterward, Jesus appeared in different form to 2 of them when they were walking the country. Now, when you look at this first line here, and then when you look at the second, you can see pieces from the other Gospels. For example, verse 12. He was walking with 2 of them, and they were walking in the country. What does that sound like? Well, it's actually Luke, the Emmaus Road.
Yeah.
Remember the 2 disciples? It sounds like he's referring to the Emmaus Road. Verse 14, later he appeared to the 11 as they were eating and rebuked them. That sounds like John, as to what he's put it. And then he said to them, go into all the world and preach the gospel. That sounds like Matthew. It sounds like somebody put this to capture the different parts of each of the gospels to include here to like fill the gospel out. When linguists study these verses, it doesn't sound like the same author. It just reads slightly different as to how it puts. There's nothing unbiblical here. It just doesn't sound like it's Mark who wrote it. And then it says here, whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, and whoever does not believe will be condemned. This, again, sounds like other Gospels. And these signs will accompany those who believe. Now, the backwoods Pentecostals love these couple verses here. In my name they will drive out demons, they will speak in tongues, and they will pick up snakes in their hands, and they will drink deadly poison. There are back hills churches in Tennessee that actually have snake handlers. Now, this is not an instruction to pick up snakes and drink poison to test your faith. Although there are churches that do that. They actually bring snakes in to see if you're really, a Christian or not, because the snake will not bite you. That is not what they're saying. But why would they include this? Whoever wrote this. This is what happened with Paul. Remember when Paul, at the end of the book of Acts, a snake latched onto him, and he shook it off, and everyone's waiting for Paul to drop dead.
Right.
And he didn't. What this author is saying, that was Paul's testimony. It didn't happen to him. They had things happen which showed God's preservation. But as we look back historically, that is not because God is saying that nobody who's bitten by a snake who is a Christian will never be impacted by it. It's that if he chooses that this person will not be impacted by it, because this person is on a divine mission, it's not going to affect them. That's all this is saying. And it says, after the Lord had spoken to them, he was taken into heaven and sat at the right hand of God. Then the disciples went out and preached everywhere, which is what Acts records. And the Lord worked with them and confirmed his word with the signs that accompanied it. Exactly what we see. So what we see at the end of Mark, it shows up everywhere else in Scripture. But it's probably not Mark who wrote it. So it's not unbiblical stuff. It's just probably not Mark who wrote it. And so scholars wanting to have integrity, they put that little line and they say the oldest manuscripts we have don't have that section. And, it doesn't seem linguistically to be written by Mark. But that doesn't mean it's not sound or biblical in terms of where we see these things, as they appear. So that wraps up Mark as a gospel. And we are going to begin again, if you're interested in the Bible class, the third or fourth week of September. It will be advertised plenty. And based on your vote, it looks like we're doing the book of Genesis next year. And possibly, if Darlene gets her way, gets her way, we might do a summer study for maybe 4 weeks or something. But I have to ponder that still. Balancing vacations and all that other kind of stuff. Let's close in prayer. Father, we thank you for the chance we've had to be together tonight. We pray, Lord, that you would bless us as we ponder these truths. And Lord, tonight we really talked about perhaps the greatest thing mankind has ever known, that God sent his Son into this world to die for our sins, for our transgressions, and that in him we have life. We thank you for this. Go with us now as we ponder this. In Jesus' name, amen.